this message will be taking place in one singular book, and that book is in the book of Daniel. All right? You know, if you're there for morning devotion every Wednesday at 5 a.m. at Zoom, you'll hear a little snippet of what I'm going to share today. So let's go to the book of Daniel, and we'll start off in chapter 1. Now, when Sister Rachel touched on the point of, us being brought up from the dust, that's a good prayer point. But, there are things we have to, do in order to maintain that, bringing up from the dust. And this message, this teaching is going to help you do that. All right? Daniel chapter 1. But first we need to, know about Daniel, who Daniel was, how Daniel was. So we'll return to these chapters. I just want to read chapter 1, verse 20. Verse 20 says, "And in all matters of wisdom and understanding, about which the king examined them, he found them 10 times better," that is Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, 10 times better than all the magicians and astrologers who are in all his realm. Thus Daniel continued until the first year of King Cyrus. So first thing, we know Daniel was better than the rest of the wise men, the rest of the magicians, along with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And Daniel was also rich. He was prosperous, as we read chapter 6, verse 28. Chapter 6, verse 28. You don't have to flip there yet because we're going back to these chapters to understand more. But we're just understanding who Daniel was, how Daniel was. It says, "So this Daniel prospered in the reign of Darius and in the reign of Cyrus the Persian." So Daniel was very prosperous, and we'll see why he was prosperous as this chapter explains. And so now we know Daniel was wise. He was very prosperous, but it didn't come for no reason. It didn't come because he did nothing. He was just there. He did a lot of things that he did not have to do in order to get to this level. And we'll see how everyone is favoring Daniel. Everyone loved Daniel. Everyone, respected Daniel. And we'll see why. Let's start in Daniel chapter 1. Daniel chapter 1, and we'll start from verse 1. "In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, with some of the articles of the house of God, which he carried into the land of Shinar, to the house of his God. And he brought the articles into the treasure house of his God." So yeah, you guys know who King Nebuchadnezzar is. Some of you might be familiar, with the story of when King Nebuchadnezzar threw Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego into the fire. And, they survived. And King Nebuchadnezzar was like, "What? Okay, everybody serve this God." But we'll look more into that. And we'll look more into, the difference between Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and Daniel. There's a difference. But we'll continue reading. Chapter 1, verse 3. "Then the king instructed Ashpenaz, the master of his eunuchs," I don't know how to pronounce that, eunuchs, sounds like Enoch, eunuchs, "to bring some of the children of Israel and some of the king's descendants and some of the nobles, young men in whom there was no blemish, but good-looking, gifted in all wisdom, possessing knowledge, and quick to understand, who had ability to serve in the king's palace, and whom they might teach the language and literature of the Chaldeans." So they basically wanted perfect young men to come serve for the king. So they just brought them in, and we'll see what they had to do. Verse 5, "And the king appointed for them a daily provision of the king's delicacies and of the wine which he drank, and 3 years of training for them, so that at the end of that time they might serve before the king." So they were like, "Okay, go find some people to serve the king, and we'll give them food, wine, drink, water, whatever they need, and we'll give them 3 years of training so that they can serve before the king." So yeah, that was a good plan. So remember, a part of this is Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. We read verse 6. Now from among those of the sons of Judah were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. This Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah is just Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, but they had name changes. I think from the king, not sure from who, but they had name changes. But yeah, it says in verse 7. I thought I said it later, but verse 7. To them, the chief of the eunuchs gave names. He gave Daniel the name Belteshazzar, to Hananiah, Shadrach, to Mishael, Meshach, and to Azariah, Abednego. So Daniel is Belteshazzar, but we call him more Daniel. And Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, we call them more Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So yeah. So now we know these people, they were brought to 3 years training. They were given the king's delicacies, whatever food the king had, and they were there for 3 years training. And at the end of that time, they would serve before the king. And these people are wise men. They had knowledge, were quick to understand, gifted in all wisdom, and had ability to serve in the king's palace. But we have to remember that Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego had 10 times more wisdom, more knowledge and understanding than the rest of the magicians, astrologers, the rest of all these people. 10 times. And we have to remember, Daniel was the one who prospered in the land during the reign of Cyprus, or whatever his name. I think the land was called Cyprus, not the king name, but yeah. So let's read verse 8. But Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with the portion of the king's delicacies, nor with the wine which he drank. Therefore he requested of the chief of the eunuchs that he might not defile himself. So here's one of the things Daniel did different. The first thing Daniel did different was he rejected the food the king had. He was like, I do not want to eat this. Can I just not eat this, please? So he asked the chief of the eunuchs, please, I do not want to eat the king's delicacies. He does not want to defile himself with that food. Now imagine that the food the king is eating, he does not want to eat. The meat, the chicken, the pork, the stuff that kings eat, and the wine, he does not want to eat and drink that. But it's not good food who wants to eat. It's not delicious food Daniel wants to bring. We'll see what Daniel wants to eat after. But let's continue reading. Verse 9. Now God had brought Daniel into the favor and goodwill of the chief of the eunuchs. So if God did not favor Daniel like that and did not bring Daniel into favor, Daniel would probably get into lots of trouble, like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego did. But we'll see more on that. But God brought Daniel into the favor and goodwill of the chief of the eunuchs. And the chief of the eunuchs said to Daniel, I fear my lord the king, who has appointed your food and drink. For why should he see your faces looking worse than the young men who are your age? Then you would endanger my head before the king. So the chief of the eunuchs was like, hey, please, just eat the king's food. If you look bad, if you look worse than the rest, then you're putting my life in danger. Just eat the king's food, please. And remember, God had brought Daniel into the favor of the chief of the eunuchs. If he was not favored, maybe the chief would be like, no, go eat the king's food. I reject your offer and stuff. But the chief of the eunuchs was nice. He was like, I fear the king. I do not want my head to be endangered. I do not want my life to be at risk. But we'll see Daniel's response. Verse 11, Daniel chapter 1. So Daniel said to the steward, whom the chief of the eunuchs had set over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, please test your servants for 10 days, and let them give us vegetables to eat and water to drink. So instead of king's delicacies and wine, Daniel wanted to eat vegetables and water every day. Vegetables and water. Every day Daniel wanted to eat vegetables and water. Imagine that. Daniel's rejecting this great food this king has for vegetables and water. And that's not even, the most surprising thing I find in the book of Daniel. But we'll go to some more chapters in a bit. Imagine that. Vegetables and water Daniel wanted to eat. And you can see all over in this book how Daniel was favored by God, by other people. Daniel is this one giving all these prophecies and visions and dreams. This angel met Daniel this angel met Daniel and just was talking with Daniel like Daniel was his friend, and we'll see that later. But Daniel asked for vegetables and water to eat instead of the king's delicacies. And he says, test your servants for 10 days. Let them give us vegetables and water to eat and drink for 10 days, all right? Just 10 days. Verse 13, then let our appearance be examined before you, and the appearance of the young men who eat the portion of the king's delicacies, and as you see fit, so deal with your servants. So first of all, remember, Daniel is the one that's speaking for Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, or here, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, because of their name changes. So Daniel is speaking for them. He's saying, give us vegetables and water for 10 days. Try us for 10 days. Test us for 10 days with vegetables and water. And then you feed the rest of the young men with the king's delicacies, whatever the king eats, whatever the king gives them. The wine, the pork, the chicken, the soup, whatever kings eat. I don't know if kings eat soup. Do kings eat soup? I don't know. But yeah, whatever the king's food, the food of the king that the king gives them, give that to the other young men. And as you see fit, so deal with your servants. If vegetables and water wins, give us all that. If king delicacies win, give us all that. So this is the wisdom of Daniel. And Daniel was not going to leave his vegetables and water for anything. So he says, okay, just give us a test. We'll see which one is better. Verse 14, so he consented with them, that's the chief of the eunuchs. He consented with them in this matter and tested them 10 days. So the chief of the eunuchs, remember, God brought the chief of the eunuchs into the favor of Daniel. Or rather, God brought Daniel into the favor of the chief of the eunuchs. So yeah, Daniel was favored by the chief. And the chief was like, okay, I'll do this test. It sounds good. It sounds like a wise thing to do. So they ate vegetables and water for 10 days. And the rest of the young men ate not vegetables, but rather the king's delicacies and wine for 10 days. So let's see the results. Verse 15. And at the end of the 10 days, their features, that is Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, and Daniel, their features appeared better and fatter in flesh than all of the young men who ate the portion of the king's delicacies. Now imagine lettuce, salad, and carrots versus chicken, pork, and you become fatter in flesh than those who eat the king's delicacies and wine and all of that. Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego appeared fatter and better in flesh than the rest. And that's very fascinating, very interesting. Daniel would not leave his vegetables and water for the richness of food that the king had to offer. For that great food the king was offering, Daniel would not leave his vegetables and water. Because if we read verse 8, it said, Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with the delicacies of the king. Once Daniel heard, you're not going to be eating vegetables and water, but rather the king, whatever the king wants you to eat, Daniel was like, I'm not going to do this. I'm going to do whatever in my power not to eat that. And he even, brought the proposal, I do not want to eat this. Can I eat vegetables and water instead? And he did that test. Those who ate the vegetables and water appeared better and fatter in flesh than those who ate the king's delicacies. And this isn't the most surprising thing. We have more chapters to go to. But still remember that Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were 10 times better than the rest of the young men, than the rest of the magicians, the rest of the astrologers. They were 10 times better. And verse 16, thus the steward took away their portion of delicacies and the wine that they were given, that they were to drink, and gave them vegetables. Imagine how mad the rest of the young men were. They just got all their good food taken away, and now they have to eat vegetables and water. Imagine how mad they were. But it was for the better good. It was to better them. It was to make them healthier and stronger. It made them better and fatter and healthier in their flesh. And the vegetables and water won over all of the king's delicacies. Imagine how much wisdom, how such wisdom Daniel and the rest of them had. Imagine that. And verse 17, as for these 4 young men, God gave them knowledge and skill in all literature and wisdom. And Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. So God had given them their knowledge. God had given them their skill in literature and all wisdom. God was the one that gave them this knowledge. But who told Daniel to go eat vegetables and water? Was it God who said, Daniel, you shall eat vegetables and water? I'm not one to speak for Daniel, but I wouldn't think that God told Daniel, you must eat vegetables and water. But because of this knowledge and wisdom Daniel had, Daniel was like, okay, I'm going to reject the king's delicacies. I'm going to eat vegetables and water. That was a habit that Daniel built up for himself. And because of this habit, he was better than the rest of the young men. He was wiser, and he was stronger, he was healthier because of this choice he made, because of that decision. Imagine that. So God gave them that knowledge. God gave them that information. And yet it was up to Daniel to choose whether he wants to eat the king's delicacies or the vegetables and water. You know, vegetables and water, it doesn't look good on the outside. You know, just eating leaves and carrots and plants along with water, that doesn't sound very appetizing as much as wine and chicken and ham and beef and stuff like that. It doesn't sound as appetizing, in my opinion. I don't know about your opinion, but in my opinion, lettuce and water doesn't sound as appetizing. But Daniel made it up in his heart. He was like, I'm going to eat these vegetables and water. Lunch, supper, breakfast, dinner, whatever he ate, I'm going to eat vegetables and water. And let's read verse 18. Now at the end of the days, that is after the 3 years is done, 3 years is over of testing, the 3 years of testing is done. Now at the end of the days, when the king had said that they should be brought in, the chief of the eunuchs brought them in before Nebuchadnezzar. Then the king interviewed them, and among them all, none was found like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So the king was like, okay, I'm going to ask you a series of questions. You answer them however way you want. I'm going to ask you these questions. He asked every one of the young men the questions. Out of all of them, every single one of them, there was not a single one that was found like Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And remember, what's his name? Ashpenaz, the master of the eunuchs. He was sent out to choose the wisest men, the best-looking men, the gifted in all wisdom men, the men in whom there was no blemish. Just get all of them. And imagine, out of all of that small select group, only a smaller select group in that small select group was better than the rest. Imagine that. Because God had given Daniel knowledge. God had given Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego knowledge, wisdom. And God had given Daniel understanding in all visions and dreams. And they did not, let it sit in their head. They did not let it sit in their notes or whatever they had. They did not let it sit in their scroll that they written with their ink pen. They did not let it sit there. They put it into practice and went above and beyond by even suggesting to eat vegetables and water and not king delicacies. Imagine that. But there's still more that Daniel did. There's still more habits Daniel built up. There's still more knowledge that Daniel applied, and we'll look into in a bit. And if you continue verse 19, it says, therefore they served before the king. Verse 20. And in all matters of wisdom and understanding, about which the king examined them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and astrologers who were in his realm. So first of all, out of the young men, there was none found like Daniel and the 3 others. There was none found like them. And now in all of these grown adults, astrologers and magicians who can do whatever they want, out of all of them, Daniel and them were still 10 times better than them, those magicians and astrologers. Not just the young men, but better than the magicians and astrologers who have been working there for years, who had been there for their entire life, the magicians and astrologers. It's not like Daniel could pick up a stick and it turns into a snake and stuff. Daniel was gifted in visions and dreams and stuff like that. That's what Daniel had understanding in. Not like stuff like you move mountains and big stuff that you see like that. It was just dreams and visions. Daniel had a lot of dreams. He could share a lot of visions. He could share their interpretation. But Daniel had knowledge. He had wisdom. He had understanding, and it was given by God. And he did not just let the wisdom sit there. He applied knowledge. He applied it diligently. He built up a habit. That's what applied knowledge is. That's what diligently applied knowledge is. That's a habit. He built up habits of eating vegetables and water. He built up a habit of whatever else we're going to look into in this teaching. He built up that habit. And Daniel was 10 times better, not just than the young men, but the magicians and astrologers who had already been there for years. Verse 21, thus Daniel continued until the first year of King Cyrus. All right, so let's go to Daniel chapter 6. That's 5 chapters away. Now remember, if you're doing good, there will always be people who hate on you and stuff. Like, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they refused to bow down before the golden idol, and then people just came and say, hey, we caught these 3 men. They did not bow down before your idol. So yeah, there will always be haters, trying to stop these people because they have no wisdom. They're jealous. They're covetous of this such wisdom that they had. Chapter 6, verse 1. It pleased Darius, that's the king of the land at this time after Nebuchadnezzar. It pleased Darius to set over the kingdom 120 satraps to be over the whole kingdom. And over these 3 governors, of whom Daniel was one, that the satraps might give account to them, so that the king would suffer no loss. So imagine, even during King Darius' time, Daniel was still heading above the satraps. So there were the satraps, they had these 3 governors, Daniel was one of them. So he was still leading during this time as well. Verse 3. Then Daniel distinguished himself above the governors and the satraps, because an excellent spirit was in him. And the king gave thought to setting him over the whole realm. So Daniel distinguished himself. He was not like the other people. He was way above them, but not just because he had knowledge, but he applied it, and he went above and beyond. Remember, Daniel decided to eat vegetables and water instead of the king's delicacies. And we'll see more of what Daniel did, the more the knowledge which Daniel applied. Daniel distinguished himself above the governors and the satraps. Just 3 governors there were. Daniel was above the other 2. And all the 120 satraps. So he was better than everybody else except King Darius, at least here. But he was probably still better than King Darius. But, he had a lower position than him. But Daniel was above all the rest of the people who were working with him, who were working for him, above all of them. And the king was like, maybe I should just give him rule over the entire realm, the entire kingdom. I'll just give it to Daniel. Daniel is already doing all of this. He's making everything good. I might as well just give him rulership, ownership over the whole realm. But we'll see Daniel's haters, of course, because he was doing good. Verse 4. So the governors and satraps sought to find some charge against Daniel concerning the kingdom. So the governors, the other 2 governors and the 120 satraps, they were like, Daniel is doing good. We need to stop him. We're not going to let him be better than us. We're not going to let him just exceed us like that. So instead of bettering themselves, instead of bettering themselves, they choose to bring Daniel down. That's how unwise and stupid these people were. They were like, we're not going to do what Daniel does. We're not going to eat vegetables and water. We're not going to pray like this. We're not going to fast like this. We're just going to bring Daniel down instead of build ourselves up. And of course, that backfired heavily, but we'll see that. So they were like, let's bring Daniel down. We're not going to bring him up. We're not going to bring ourselves up. We're going to put him down. So they sought to find some charge against Daniel. Verse 4 continued, but they could find no charge or fault, because he was faithful, nor was there any error or fault found in him. So see, first Daniel distinguished himself above all the rest of them, and now they're trying to find some fault in him. But he was faithful. He always continued doing what he was doing. He was diligent. He never stopped in his habits. He never stopped in his good ways. He never stopped these things. He was faithful. So they could not find any charge against him. They could not find any fault against him. Verse 5, Daniel chapter 6. Then these men said, we shall not find any charge against this Daniel unless we find it against him concerning the law of his God. So imagine, Daniel was so faithful in everything that they were like, okay, he's faithful with God. We have to find a charge against his God. So we'll make him get punished for diligently worshiping God. That's what they had to do. Verse 6, they were like, we can't just ban vegetables and water, We can't just ban that from the land. We have to do something, and it can only be concerning God, because, the kings were very prideful. They like to be God themselves. So yeah. Verse 6, so these governors and satraps thronged before the king, and thus said to him, King Darius, live forever. All the governors of the kingdom, the administrators, the satraps, the counselors and advisors have consulted together to establish a royal statute and to make a firm decree that whoever petitions to any god or man for 30 days, except you, O king, shall be cast into the den of lions. So they were like, oh, king, yes, you are so great, king. We are so happy to bring this good petition before you. So whoever wants to praise any god or man except for you, O king, will be thrown into a den of lions. Yes, king, that sounds good, right? Yeah, verse 8. Now, O king, establish the decree and sign the writing so that it cannot be changed, according to the law of the Medes and Persians, which does not alter. Imagine, they hated Daniel so much. They did not want Daniel to be better than them. So they were like, we're going to cast him to a pit of lions. We're just going to bring him down, and we're not going to better ourselves. We're not going to make the king want to make us ruler over the land. No, we're going to bring him down. That's how unwise, that's how dumb and foolish and stupid these people were. They wanted to bring other people down. Then they themselves go up. Imagine that. They couldn't do the things Daniel was doing. They couldn't interpret visions like Daniel was doing. They could not have favor like Daniel had favor. They could not eat vegetables and water like Daniel was eating vegetables and water. They could not. So they were like, we'll just bring him down. And not even by just bringing him down. They wanted to kill him by putting him in a pit of lions. Imagine that. Verse 9. Therefore, King Darius signed the written decree. So now King Darius wasn't that wise, because he's sacrificing Daniel. And we'll see that Daniel was in the favor of King Darius. But King Darius was like, he was prideful. So he was like, yeah, I'm God. I'm going to be God for 30 days. Yeah, 30 days straight. That would be so great if everyone just worshiped me for 30 days. Yeah, it's not going to do anything for him, but it just feels good to be worshipped for 30 days. And imagine that. Imagine that. King Darius signed that. And that was the biggest mistake he had ever made. Biggest mistake. He had huge regret for that. And we'll see that. Verse 10. Now when Daniel knew that the writing was signed, he went home, and in his upper room with his windows open towards Jerusalem, he knelt down on his knees and prayed 3 times that day, and prayed and gave thanks before his God, as was his custom since early days. So Daniel was like, oh great, that writing's been signed. I'm going home. I'm going to kneel down before my window. I'm going to pray 3 times as usual. I'm not going to stop. Imagine, even not just when Daniel changed places, not when Daniel was pressured to not eat vegetables and water, but even when his life was in danger, he was about to die for doing this. He continued this habit of praying 3 times a day. Imagine that. He kept his habit, he kept his good practice to death, to the point of the risk of dying. Imagine that. Daniel did not give this up for anything. And not just that, he was eager to do it. When he heard that the writing was signed, he went straight home, and not just praying secretly, not praying quietly. He opened his windows so everyone could see. His windows were open, and he prayed towards Jerusalem, kneeling down, and he prayed 3 times that day, as he prayed 3 times every day. Imagine that. He would not give up his custom of praying 3 times a day for anything, not even death. Imagine that. We would not do that. No one here would do that. No one here would keep a habit, keep a good practice, knowing that it will kill you, knowing that you're going to die. No one here would do that unless you have that wisdom that Daniel had, unless you have that diligence, that knowledge, that understanding which Daniel had. Imagine that. And also, it's very, very similar to the time when King Nebuchadnezzar told Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, you must worship my God. And we'll see the difference between these two. Let's see verse 11. Then these men assembled and found Daniel praying and making supplication before his God. So these haters, they knew that Daniel would pray 3 times a day, and they knew what times he would pray. So they just came together. They're waiting for Daniel. Okay, Daniel's going to come out to pray at this time unless we do something wrong. So they just wait there. They assembled, and they catch him praying. And they're like, yes, we finally got Daniel. Daniel's going to die, finally. So they want to break Daniel down instead of build themselves up. That's how foolish these people are. So right away, verse 12, they went before the king and spoke concerning the king's decree. Have you not signed a decree that every man who petitions to any god or man within 30 days except you, O king, shall be cast into a den of lions? The king answered and said, this thing is true, according to the law of the Medes and Persians, which does not alter. So imagine, the king is already putting himself in a trap. And he's like, he's smiling during it. He doesn't even notice anything going on. He's like, yeah, this law cannot be altered. This law cannot be reversed. So yeah, what do you have to say about this? Verse 13. So they answered and said before the king, that Daniel, who is one of the captives of Judah, does not show due regard for you, O king, or for the decree that you have signed, but makes his petition 3 times a day. Imagine, the king backed himself into a wall here. He was like, yeah, this law does not alter, it cannot be changed. And they were like, yeah, we caught Daniel praying. What are you going to do about it? Verse 14. And the king, when he heard these words, was greatly displeased with himself, and set his heart on Daniel to deliver him. And he labored till the going down of the sun to deliver him. He realized he made a big mistake because, you have to understand, why was King Darius so sad about Daniel leaving? He was crying about Daniel going away. And at the end of this chapter, the king easily just threw the rest of the satraps and the governors who were betrayers, he threw them into the pit. He could do that with ease. But he could not just send Daniel into the lion's den. How could he do that? Imagine that. But if you compare this to when King Nebuchadnezzar threw Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego into the fire, it says that King Nebuchadnezzar was angry. He even said, turn up the fire 7 times. 7 times the heat, and throw Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in there. He did that with no remorse. So what was the difference between Daniel? Daniel was so favored before King Darius, and he was like, please, save this man. I will do anything to save this man. He was staying up all night, all day, saying, I will deliver this man. I will not let this man die. And even in verse 19, wait, not verse 19, that's the wrong verse. I flipped the page. Verse, I think this page flipped. Oh, yeah. Verse 15. Then these men approached the king and said to the king, know, O king, that it is the law of the Medes and Persians that no decree or statute which the king establishes may be changed. So the king gave the command, and they brought Daniel and cast him into the den of lions. But the king spoke, saying to Daniel, your God whom you serve continually, he will deliver you. Then a stone was brought and laid on the mouth of the den, and the king sealed it with his own signet, and with the rings of his lords, with his own signet ring and with the signets of his lords, that the purpose concerning Daniel might not be changed. But not only was the king uneasy, verse 18, now the king went to his palace and spent the night fasting, and no musicians were brought before him. Also his sleep went from him. Imagine that. This King Darius, he fasted, he slept for a man who should be dead by now, Daniel. He fasted, he had no sleep, he was awake. He could not sleep. Sleep ran from him, sleep fled from him because a was in a pit. Imagine that. And if you compare King Darius and Daniel versus Nebuchadnezzar and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, you'll see King Nebuchadnezzar had no remorse for throwing Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego into the pit for worshiping another god. But King Darius fasted and had no sleep, stayed up all night because Daniel worshiped another god. You see the difference? And we have to understand, Daniel was doing something Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego did not do. When we read in chapter 1, Daniel was making that petition for Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego that they should not eat the king's delicacies and wine, but they should eat vegetables and water. And whichever one wins, that's what you'll give us for the rest of the 3 years. Imagine that. They did not, the Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego did not bring up the petition. Daniel spoke for them, and he said, give us vegetables and water for 10 days, and whichever one wins, you give us. Imagine that. And now, Daniel has another habit of praying on his knees toward the window 3 times a day. And even when it cost his life, and he knew it cost his life, he did not stop praying 3 times a day at that window. He knew he's going to die if he prays at that window. He still went ahead and did it. But we'll see. Continue reading in verse 19. Then the king arose very early in the morning and went into haste to the den of lions. Imagine this King Darius, who would later easily throw the satraps and the governors who were betrayers into the pit, easily did that. He ran with haste in the morning just to see if Daniel was alive in the pit somehow. Verse 20. And when he came to the den, he cried out with a lamenting voice to Daniel. The king spoke, saying to Daniel, Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you serve continually, been able to deliver you from the lions? So imagine that. The satraps in them must have looked at Daniel as, not Daniel, but as King Darius as stupid. Because you can't just talk to a dead man like that. You don't tell a dead man, hey, has your God been able to save you? Daniel should have been dead by then. You know, Daniel been cast into a den of lions for a day and a night. And now King Darius is over there saying, hey, Daniel, you alive there? You alive down there, Daniel? Imagine that. He must have been looked at as stupid. But we'll continue reading. Verse 21. Then Daniel said to the king, O king, live forever. My God sent his angel and shut the lions' mouths so that they have not hurt me, because I was found innocent before him. And also, O king, I have done no wrong before you. So we've been seeing how God favored Daniel, been favoring Daniel, bringing Daniel into the favor of people, and favoring Daniel himself. And we see Daniel distinguish himself from all the rest of the governors, the satraps. He was better than everybody else, to the point where a king cannot sleep. A king is not just not sleeping, but fasting into fasting. When he was the same one who wanted everyone to worship him and no other God but him. But now he's praying and fasting, no sleep, for this one man, Daniel, because he wants Daniel to live. He does not want Daniel to die. Imagine that. Imagine that. You are of so much value that a king is up all night because he wishes that you're not dead. And he goes to the pit, calls out for Daniel. You alive down there, Daniel? When Daniel is meant to be dead by now. And we'll see later, not even when the rest of the governors and satraps who were betrayers, they were cast into the pit. They barely even touched the pit, and they were already eaten up. So Daniel should have been dead by a day and a night, for sure. But Daniel said, because he was found innocent before God, God decided, okay, we'll shut the mouth of the lions because you're innocent before me. Imagine that. God favored Daniel so much. Daniel was in the favor of God so much. And yes, and God favored Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego as well, because God saved them from the fire, and they came out without any scorch or burn. But there's a big difference, because when Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego worshipped another god, when King Nebuchadnezzar had no remorse for sending them into that fire, he said, heat it up 7 times. But when Daniel worshipped his God, King Darius was like, Daniel, you okay down there? Please be alive, Daniel. I fasted. I had no sleep. Sleep ran from me. Please, Daniel, be alive. Imagine that. Because because nobody else was like Daniel. Nobody else could build up habits like that like Daniel. Nobody else was diligent like Daniel. Nobody else would continue fasting and praying for 3 days, 3 times a day, in front of a window, knowing that he's going to die. Nobody else would do that. Verse 23. Now the king was exceedingly glad for him and commanded that they should take Daniel up out of the den. So Daniel was taken up out of the den, and no injury whatever was found on him, because he believed in his God. And the king gave the command, and they brought those men who had accused Daniel, and they cast them into the den of lions, them, their children, their wives. And the lions overpowered them, and broke all their bones in pieces before they ever came to the bottom of the den. Imagine that. They were like, yeah, lower them, bring them into the pit. They were just lowering them. They were already eaten. They didn't even have to bring it all the way up, all the way down. They were like, oh yeah, just bring the rope up. They already eaten. Like, imagine that. And King Darius was calling, hey, Daniel, you alive down there after a whole entire day? Imagine that. But King Darius could easily just throw them into the pit. But he could not easily throw Daniel into the pit like that, because he favored Daniel, because God had brought Daniel into his favor. Imagine that. And Daniel had such habits, such diligence, such application of knowledge, such habits that the king could not even send him down into the pit. But King Nebuchadnezzar could easily just throw Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego into the fire for not worshiping him. Imagine that. And King Darius just sent them all to the bottom of the den. And after that, King Darius was like, you know what, here's a new rule. Everybody worship Daniel's God. I don't care who you are, you must worship Daniel's God or you die. Worship Daniel's God. Imagine that. King Darius was so happy because Daniel survived, because Daniel was alive. Imagine that. And God favored Daniel. And God brought Daniel into the favor of others. But I'm certain it wasn't God who told Daniel, you must pray 3 times a day in front of the window. I don't think, I'm not speaking for Daniel, but I don't think God told Daniel to do that. Daniel chose to pray 3 times a day in front of the window, and he would not give that up for anything. I don't think it was God who told Daniel to eat vegetables and water. But Daniel chose to eat vegetables and water, and he became fatter and better in flesh than all of them young men who ate the king's delicacies and wine and chicken and pork and all that stuff. Imagine that. Daniel had such wisdom and application of wisdom that God gave him more and more and more and more, and overflowed him, because Daniel would put it into practice. Daniel would use it. Daniel would not just leave it there and let it rot. Daniel would use that wisdom up, use that knowledge up. Imagine that. And let's go to Daniel chapter 10. In addition to the vegetables and water and the praying at the window 3 times a day, imagine that. Daniel was just like that. Daniel chose to do these things. And he ended up better than all the rest of the young men, and 10 times better than the magicians and astrologers who were already there. Not that Daniel did a miracle or could do a miracle. All he did was interpret dreams and visions, and God gave him some dreams and visions. That's what Daniel did. But he was still better than the magicians and astrologers by 10 times. 10 times. Magicians and astrologers who can pick up a podium and it turns into a ball of dirt and stuff like that. They could do that. But Daniel was just a vision and dream interpreter, and he was found 10 times better than the astrologers and the magicians and all the rest of them. So Daniel chapter 10, we looked at 2 different habits that Daniel had. Daniel ate vegetables and water, and Daniel prayed 3 times a day in front of a window, no matter what, kneeling down in front of a window. And we'll see, Daniel still added more. Daniel never stopped what he was doing. Chapter 10 of Daniel, verse 1. In the 3rd year of Cyrus, king of Persia, a message was revealed to Daniel, whose name was called Belteshazzar. The message was true, but the appointed time was long, and he understood the message and had understanding of the vision. Imagine that. Daniel was having visions. He was not just given visions. He had understanding of the visions. And not just that, he put it into practice. He applied it. That's what Daniel did. That's what was the habit of Daniel, the big main habit with all these small habits. He did them diligently. He never stopped. He continued on his vegetables and water. He continued on his distinguishing of himself than others. He continued on his praying 3 times a day. He continued on. He never stopped, no matter how old, how young. And imagine, Daniel was still a young man when he chose to eat vegetables and water over the king's delicacies. because they had gathered all the young men. Daniel was still young, and only 3 years later was he chosen to work for the king. Imagine that. Verse 2. In those days, I, Daniel, was mourning 3 full weeks. I ate no pleasant food, no meat or wine came into my mouth, nor did I anoint myself at all, till 3 whole weeks were fulfilled. Imagine that. Daniel chooses to fast. He could just set his mind, okay, I'm going to go fast, and he just fasts for 3 weeks. Imagine that. No plan of stopping, just go fast 3 weeks fully. And we'll see that the angel was sent to Daniel on the first day. So Daniel was just continuing fasting. Once the angel came, delivered his message, Daniel stopped fasting. Daniel just continued fasting until he got his message. 3 weeks is like 21 days. Yeah, 7 times plus 7 plus 7, that's 21. 3 weeks fasting. No pleasant food, no wheat, meat or wine, none of that, till 3 whole weeks were fulfilled. Verse 4. Now on the 24th day of the first month, as I was by the side of the great river, that is the Tigris, I lifted my eyes and looked, and behold, a certain man clothed in linen, whose waist was girded with gold of Uphaz. His body was like beryl, his face like the appearance of lightning, his eyes like torches of fire, his arms and feet like burnished bronze in color, and the sound of his words like the voice of the multitude. So this is a vision that Daniel is seeing. But we'll see when the angel comes to Daniel and talks to Daniel and speaks to Daniel. Verse 7. And I, Daniel, alone saw the vision. For the men who were with me did not see the vision, but a great terror fell upon them, so that they fled to hide themselves. Therefore I was left alone when I saw this great vision, and no strength remained in me, for my vigor was turned into frailty in me, and I retained no strength. Imagine that. Daniel was able to just stay through that. The rest of the men just ran away. But Daniel was like, I'm just lying down there. I have no strength. I'm just frail, lying down there. Verse 9. Yet I heard the sound of his words, and while I heard the sound of his words, I was in a deep sleep on my face, with my face to the ground. And then verse 10. Suddenly a hand touched me, which made me tremble on my knees and on the palms of my hand. And he said to me, O Daniel, man greatly beloved, understand the words that I speak to you, and stand upright, for I have now been sent to you. While he was speaking this word to me, I stood trembling. Then he said to me, do not fear, Daniel. So imagine that. This angel comes to Daniel and says, hey, Daniel, stand up. I have a word for you. Listen to my word. And Daniel's just lying down on the ground, trembling. Imagine that. Angels usually come, their first word is, do not be afraid, do not fear. And this angel comes, oh, Daniel, you are greatly highly exalted and stuff. I've been sent to you. Stand up so you can receive this word. And then after he realized Daniel is afraid, he's like, do not fear, Daniel. Do not be afraid. Imagine that. This angel could just talk to Daniel like that. When angels usually come to people and say, hey, do not be afraid. Do not fear. Do not be afraid. That's how angels introduce themselves. But this angel is like, oh, Daniel, great man greatly beloved. Daniel is lying down face down, and he just feels a hand come upon him. And this voice say, oh, Daniel, greatly beloved. Imagine that. That's how much favor was with Daniel. That's how much Daniel was favored. He was favored in the sight of God. He was favored with other people. He was favored with angels. Imagine all of that. The angel could just come to Daniel and say, and speak like that. Stand upright, for I've been now sent to you. And Daniel just stood trembling. He was there afraid. And then the angel was like, do not be afraid, Daniel. And let's continue reading verse 12, Daniel chapter 10, verse 12. Do not fear, Daniel, for from the first day that you set your heart to understand and to humble yourself before your God, your words were heard. Imagine that. Daniel, the first day, he decided, I'm going to go fast. I'm going to go pray. I'm just going to go pray and fast. That first day, the angel was sent. God was like, oh, Daniel's praying. Go visit him. I have a word for him already. First day. The first day this angel was sent. And let's continue reading. And I have come because of your words. Verse 13. But the prince of the kingdom of Persia withstood me 21 days. And behold, Michael, one of the chief priests, came to help me, for I had been left alone with the kings of Persia. So you realize this angel is telling all of this to Daniel, a man. The angel could tell intimate things. deep things of God to Daniel. He was like, "Oh yeah, Daniel, sorry, I apologize for being late, Daniel. I'm sorry I was late. I have a word to bring for you, but I'm sorry for being late. You know, I was kept up there. The king of Persia withstood me. I was stood against by the king of Persia. Sorry for being late, Daniel." Imagine that. An angel, great angel, is apologizing to a man for being late for delivering a message to him. Imagine that. That's how much Daniel was favored in people, with God, with angels, with everyone, with beings, with everything. And he was favored so much that the satraps and the governors, they came against him, to plot against him. You know, instead of bettering their own self, they wanted to bring Daniel down. And guess what? They were brought down in the end. Imagine that. Imagine that. Daniel was favored with everybody, with everyone, with everything, with every being. Imagine that. And Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, God favored them too, but they were not in the favor of the king. King Nebuchadnezzar was like, turn up the fire 7 times and throw them in there. But King Darius was like, please, can we just keep Daniel? We don't have to throw him in, you know. Can we just keep Daniel here? And when they threw Daniel into the pit, he did not sleep. He fasted, all of that. A king fasting for a mere man. And King Nebuchadnezzar was like, turn up the heat 7 times and throw Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in there. God favored both of them, yes. Well, all of them, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and Daniel. God favored them. But the difference was their application of knowledge, their application of wisdom. Daniel was the one that had to speak for Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego when he went to the king and said, please give us vegetables and water for 10 days and test us. Daniel had to speak for them. And we read in verse 28 of chapter 6, so this Daniel prospered in the reign of Darius and in the reign of Cyrus the Persian. So Daniel was prosperous. He was rich. He was wealthy. He was prospering. And even King Darius was like, maybe I should set him over all of this realm. Maybe I should just set him ruler over all of this. Imagine that. So chapter 10 of Daniel, verse 14. Now I have come to make you understand what will happen to your people in the latter days. For this vision refers many days yet to come. When he had spoken such words to me, I turned my face toward the ground and became speechless. So Daniel had this vision, and now he's just lying face down on the floor. Angel touches his shoulder, saying, "Oh, Daniel, stand up now. I have a word for you." And Daniel's just trembling there. And this angel says, "Do not fear, Daniel." Imagine that. An angel could just share deep things of God, deep things in the spirit. Just share that with Daniel. Say, I'm sorry, Daniel, the king of Persia." Daniel probably doesn't even know who that is. But the angel's like, he's familiar with these things. And because the angel's familiar with these things, he just shares them with Daniel. Because Daniel applies knowledge so much, and Daniel is favored by God so much that this angel can just share the deep things of God with him. And not only did the angel share deep things of God, God shared the deep things of God with him. You see, all of these visions that Daniel has, you see, Daniel was even given visions of the end time, prophecies of the end time. In chapter 11, chapter 12, we see the abomination of desolation, which Jesus talks about. And he says in the end time, you will see the abomination of desolation being built up or something like that. And you even see at the end of days, many shall run to and fro, and knowledge shall increase in the end days. You see, God told that to Daniel before that was even close to happening. God shared that with Daniel. And an angel could just share the deep things of God with Daniel, just like that. Just like that, without having to think it through. Should I share this to Daniel? No. The angel was like, "Oh, Daniel, I'm sorry. I was kind of stuck up there for a bit of time, for 21 days, but I was sent to you from the first day." Imagine that. And Daniel's just there praying. If the angel came on the first day, yeah, Daniel would stop there. But it doesn't seem like Daniel's going to stop praying until he sees that angel, until he sees that vision. He's just there praying and fasting, no pleasant food, nothing like that, praying and fasting. And finally, after 21 days, the angel finally visits him. Imagine that. And Daniel has such visions, such prophecies. And Daniel asks, in chapter 12, in verse 6, "How long shall the fulfillment of these wonders be?" And then Verse 7, then I heard the man clothed in linen who was above the waters of the river, when he held up his right hand and his left hand to heaven and swore by him who lives forever, that it shall be for a time, times, and half a time. And when the power of the holy people has been completely shattered, all these things shall be finished. Although I heard, I did not understand. Then I said, my Lord, what shall be the end of these things? And he said, go your way, Daniel, for the words are closed up and sealed till the time of the end. Many shall be purified, made white, and refined, but the wicked shall do wickedly, and none of the wicked shall understand, but the wise shall understand. And from the time that the daily sacrifice is taken away, and the abomination of desolation is set up, there shall be 1,290 days. Blessed is he who waits, and comes to the 1,335 days. But you go your way till the end, for you shall rest, and will arise to your inheritance at the end of days. This angel, God, was sharing things with Daniel that he would not, stay on this earth and live to see. But, he was saying, you will rest, you will die, but you will arise to your inheritance at the end of days. That's what God was sharing with Daniel. Things that Daniel wouldn't even live to see, but he would still live because he would arise to his inheritance. But like things that were years off, that he would die before then, that he would rest, as he says, before then. Things like that, God was sharing with Daniel. And the angel was sharing intimate things of God, deep things of God. Imagine that. And Daniel was found 10 times better than the magicians and astrologers. Magicians who can just pick up the tree and it turns into a jug of oil. Or astrologers who could say, the time is 12:30, that means it's lunchtime, or something like that. Things like that. Daniel was found 10 times better than that. Daniel was found 10 times better than them. But it just says God had given him dreams and visions, not flashy miracles and stuff like that. He just had knowledge and wisdom. He was able to interpret dreams and visions, and he was found 10 times better. Just imagine that. So, study the life of Daniel. Apply the stuff you did into your own life. Daniel had habits he built up, habits he did, and he would not leave for anything, even death. He would not leave these habits. He prayed 3 times a day in front of a window. Who told him to do that? I do not believe God told him to do that. I'm not speaking for Daniel, but I do not believe that God told Daniel, you must pray 3 times a day in front of your window, kneeling down. Because even when the law came out, you shall not pray to any other God but King Darius or you die, Daniel still went home. He went straight home. He opened the window, knelt down on his knees in front of that window, and he prayed 3 times that day, as was his custom. It was his custom to do that. He did that every day, and even to the point of death. But God still spared him because he was found innocent before God. That's what he said. Daniel said, because I was found innocent before God, God spared me. But God had so much favor for Daniel and for Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. But Daniel had applied more knowledge and wisdom that King Darius could not just let Daniel just leave like that. It was impossible for King Darius to settle on letting him leave like that. He even threw the satraps and the governors into the pit with no remorse. But he could just not let Daniel die like that. Daniel was so diligent and applied so much knowledge. Imagine that. It's up to you what you want to do with this word. I hope you apply knowledge. I hope you are diligent just like Daniel was diligent. I hope you are favored in front of other people like Daniel was. And even habits you choose to do, even if it leads to death. I'm not telling you to do it, but it's your choice, what you want to do. But Daniel was found wiser than all the rest of the people. Imagine that.